Paul and the kind women. Life settled into a comforting routine for Paul, his siblings, and Mrs. Johnson. They enjoyed each other's company and supported one another through their daily lives. However, trouble was brewing once again in the form of Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown. The jealous vegetable sellers had not forgotten their grudge against Paul. They were determined to find a way to ruin his business and reputation in the village. They spent days whispering and plotting, trying to come up with a plan that would make Paul leave the village for good. One evening, as Paul was setting up his cart in the small market near his house, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown approached him with fake smiles on their face. "Good evening, Paul," Mr. Smith greeted him, though his tone was far from friendly. Mrs. Brown nodded in agreement. "Yes, Paul, we were just discussing how successful your vegetable business has become." Paul looked at them warmly, sensing trouble. "Thank you," he replied cautiously. "Is there something you need?" Mr. Smith's smile turned into a sneer. "Actually, Paul, we were wondering how you managed to sell your vegetables so well. What is your secret?" Paul frowned, not liking where this conversation was heading. "There is no secret," he said firmly. "I work hard and sell fresh vegetables. People appreciate quality." Mrs. Brown exchanged a look with Mr. Smith, and then she spoke with false concern. "You know, Paul, selling your vegetables at higher prices and giving them away for free to beggars and old women, it's not good for business. People might start to wonder." Paul's heart sunk as he realized what they were implying. They were trying to smear his reputation and make people doubt him honestly and kindness. "I don't know what are you talking about," Paul said, with voice tinged with anger. "I sell my vegetables honestly, and I help those in need because it's the right thing to do." Mr. Smith chuckled mockingly. "Sure, Paul. Keep telling yourself that, but we will be watching you." With that ominous threat, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown walked away, leaving Paul feeling shaken and worried. He knew he had to be more careful now than ever. The jealousy and greed of others could threaten everything he had worked so hard to build for his family and Mrs. Johnson. Paul couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown's threat had left him with. He knew they were jealous of his success, but now with their shimming felt like a real danger to everything he had built for his family and for Mrs. Johnson. That night, as Paul sat at the dinner table with his siblings and Mrs. Johnson, he couldn't help but share his concerns. "I'm worried about Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown," he admitted, his brow furrowed with worry. "They are trying to tarnish my reputation, and I fear they won't stop until they've driven me out of the village." Mary, Paul's elder sister, looked at him with concern. "What are we going to do, Paul? We can't let them ruin everything you've worked so hard for." Michael, Paul's younger brother, spoke up with determination. "We should tell the village elders about what they are doing. Maybe they can help." Mrs. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. "It's important to stand up for what's right, Paul. Don't let their jealousy and greed intimidate you." Paul sighed heavily, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "You are right," he said finally, steeling himself with resolve. "I won't let them scare us. We've done nothing wrong, and I won't back down." The next day, Paul decided to talk to the village elders. He explained everything that had happened with Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Brown, from their jealousy to their threats against him. The elders listened attentively, their expressions grave as they considered Paul's words. After a long discussion, the elders assured Paul that they would keep an eye on Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown. They promised to talk to other villagers and make sure they understood the truth about Paul's integrity and kindness. Feeling a sense of relief, Paul returned home and shared the news with his family and Mrs. Johnson. They gathered together in the living room, grateful for the support they had received from the village elders. "I'm proud of you, Paul," Mrs. Johnson said, her eyes shining with admiration. "You handled the situation with courage and dignity." Paul smiled gratefully at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I couldn't have done it without your support and wisdom." As they sat together, enjoying a moment of peace and unity, Paul knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a strong and resilient family. As the days passed, the village elders kept a close watch on Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown. They discreetly spoke with other villagers, ensuring that Paul's reputation remained untarnished, despite the jealous shames on the two troublemakers. Meanwhile, Paul continued his routine of waking up early, buying fresh vegetables, and selling them with honesty and dedication. His customers remained loyal, knowing the quality and care Paul put into his work. The support from the villagers strengthened Paul's resolve to not let Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown's actions affect him or his family. One afternoon, as Paul was setting up his cart in the market, he noticed a group of villagers gathered around him. Curious, he approached them cautiously, wondering if there was trouble again. "Paul," one of the villagers spoke up, "we heard about what Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown have been saying. We want you to know that we believe in you. We have always been fair and kind to us." Another villager nodded in an agreement. "You are one of the hardest working young men in our village. Don't let those troublemakers get to you." Paul felt a lump in his throat at the villagers' words of support. He hadn't expected such open encouragement from them, and it touched him deeply. "Thank you," Paul said sincerely, his voice thanked with emotion. Your support means everything to me and my family. We won't let anyone disrupt our lives. The villagers nodded solemnly, their expressions filled with determination to stand by Paul and uphold justice in their community. That evening, as Paul returned home, he shared the heartwarming encounter with his family and Mrs. Johnson. They gathered around the dinner table, feeling a renewed sense of hope and strength. "I'm so proud of our village," Mary said with a smile. "It's good to know we have such caring neighbors." Michael grinned proudly. "Yeah, and they are not afraid to stand up for what's right." Mrs. Johnson pat Paul's hand affectionately. "You see, Paul, you have earned their trust and respect. No one can take that away from you." Paul nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that, with the support of his family and the villagers, he could face any challenges that came their way. Together, they were stronger than any jealousy or greed that tried to divide them. As they finished their meal that night, Paul silently thanked Mrs. Johnson for bringing them together and for the love and wisdom she had brought into their lives. She had become not just a guest in their home, but a beloved member of their family. And Paul knew they were all better off for it. The days that followed were filled with a renewed sense of peace and solidarity in the village. The villagers continued to show their support for Paul, stopping by his cart to buy vegetables and offering words of encouragement. It seemed that Mr. Smith and Mrs. Johnson's attempts to undermine Paul's reputation were having the opposite effect. They were bringing the community closer together. Paul felt a deep sense of gratitude towards his neighbors. Their unwavering support gave him strength and reassurance during uncertain times. He worked even harder, ensuring that every vegetable he sold was of the highest quality and served with a genuine smile. One afternoon, Mrs. Johnson approached Paul as he was organizing his cart. She looked thoughtfully, her hands clasped together. "Paul," she began softly, "I've been thinking about what happened with Mr. Smith and Mrs. Johnson. It's clear that their jealousy has caused a lot of trouble." Paul nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, it has been difficult, but we were managing, thanks to the support of the village." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly. "That's true, Paul, but I can't help but worry about your safety. What if they try something again?" Paul sighed, knowing Mrs. Johnson was right to be concerned. "I've been cautious, keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble, and the village elders were aware of the situation." Mrs. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's time we consider additional precautions. We could install a security light near your cot or ask a neighbor to keep watch during the evenings." Paul considered her suggestion. "That's a good idea, Mrs. Johnson. I will speak with some of the villagers and see what they think. It's important to stay vigilant." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village, Paul and Mrs. Johnson continued to discuss ways to ensure their safety. They were determined not to let fear or intimidation disrupt their lives. Later that evening, Paul gathered with his family and Mrs. Johnson for dinner. They talked about the day's events and laughed together, enjoying the simple pleasures of being together as a family. As they shared stories and shared their hopes for the future, Paul couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude. Despite the challenges they had faced, they had come through stronger and closer than ever. With Mrs. Johnson by their side, they knew they could face whatever came their way, secure in the knowledge that they were supported by a caring and resilient community. Hope you have enjoyed the reading. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.